Welcome back to Proxhammer, everybody. And today we're going to be looking at a Craftworld Forge World Eldar unit, the Shadow Spectres. So this has been kind of a popular idea for a while from a lot of my subscribers to do a video on Shadow Spectres because they're really a cool unit. They're from Forge World and they actually have rules that you can use in the game. So let's dive right into it. Let's take a deep look at the Forge World Eldar unit, Shadow Spectres. So just a quick overview of this video. We're going to be looking at the stats, weapons, and special rules of Shadow Spectres. We're going to be looking at their strengths and weaknesses. We're going to be looking at what their role is and how they can be used effectively in games. We're going to be taking a quick look at two primary builds for Shadow Spectres, and lastly, a disclaimer about using Forge World units in your army. So jumping right into their stats, they're pretty fast. They have movement 12. Otherwise, pretty average stats for Eldar. They don't have as many attacks as other Aspect Warriors as their rules are a bit dated, but they do have a decent save at a 3+. And typically you're not going to be in combat with these guys anyway, so it's not as big of a deal. Now they are 26 points a model, which is a pretty steep price for Aspect Warriors, but they are an elite's choice as well. So most battalion detachments will have a little bit of extra room to include these guys if you want to have them in your list. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Their weapon is actually a very versatile weapon. It has two profiles. The diffuse profile is effective against light infantry or chaff, things like Imperial Guardsmen, Termagants, Orc Boys, stuff like that, but it's not great at killing anything with armor of contempt or heavy armor at all. And it does have a medium distance. So it's 18 inches, it does have the blast keyword, so it's better against light infantry. And then the focus shot is extremely strong against models with 3 wounds and good armor, models like Terminators, or maybe even 2 wound models with -1 damage like Hearthguard, for example, from the Leagues of Votann. Or perhaps even Plague Marines, right? Anything with those profiles are going to be basically under the watchful eye of the Shadow Spectres, and they're going to be their primary targets. The other thing that the focus profile is good against is actually light vehicles. Things like land speeders or sentinels are also pretty vulnerable to these types of weapons. Now, the one thing I will say is between these two profiles, you should always be trying to use the focus shot when possible. The diffuse shot is just not that cost effective, and even if you can do good damage against chaff infantry, these models are kind of expensive. They're more expensive than warp spiders, and warp spiders are much better at killing chaff, right? So you really don't want to be using the diffuse profile unless you absolutely have to. In most scenarios, you're going to be wanting to use the focus profile. As for their abilities, they have a slew of them, but only a couple are really helpful. So they do get Battle Focus and Strands of Fate, which is pretty helpful for them. They are at -1 to hit, which is pretty decent for helping them stay alive at range, especially against low impact shots that don't have a lot of volume. And they can come in via reinforcements just like Sudden Assault. So they have this ability, Shade of Twilight, which is basically Sudden Assault, but for Shadow Spectres. And this allows them to be set up anywhere outside of 9 inches from enemy models from reinforcements. However, I don't recommend using this in most cases. I recommend just deploying them normally unless you're using them as part of a grander strategy that, you're using them as part of a coordinated strike or something like that. I would probably keep them out of reinforcements because they are a pretty vulnerable unit to enemy shooting. And you don't really want these guys to be screened out or honestly shot with any kind of type of Auspex scan. In addition, they also have an ability that negates 1 leadership from enemy units within 6 inches, which, to be honest with you, is probably completely worthless unless you're going for, again, some sort of weird mind war strategy. But for the most part, pretty worthless. And then, like all other Aspect Warriors, they do have a 5+ invulnerable save. Now, the kind of cool update with these guys as of recently is that they got the core keyword, so they can actually be buffed and targeted with abilities now. So they can get guide cast on them, they can benefit from doom and stuff like that. So they can actually be targeted with a lot of cool Eldar psychic powers that make them more viable. And they also have the fly keyword, so they can move through terrain and other models much easier. So what are their strengths and weaknesses? So overall, their strengths are that they are fast at movement 12. They have versatile damage, so they can kind of choose what weapon type is best for each different situation. And they are pretty hard to hit and have battle focus. So they have a pretty good range. They have battle focus, so they can get away from bad situations, skirt obscuring terrain and things like that, and remain somewhat safe. And of course, they also gain the core ability, which means they can benefit from psychic powers and buffs. However, they do have some pretty undeniable weaknesses. And the first one is the dispersed weapon profile, which is an extremely weak weapon. So basically, strength 5, AP -1 isn't going to be able to kill much of anything with any sort of armor, and it's only really good against light infantry or chaff. And if you're shooting these guys at those targets, they're never going to make their points back in time. These guys are just too expensive. They're not really going to make up their points back if they're shooting at those targets all game. And of course, lastly, they don't have access to any Exarch powers. So because they don't have access to this, they kind of don't really have a lot of options as far as different playstyles go. They're kind of locked into what they already have. And of course, their Exarch doesn't have anything special that the rest of the squad doesn't have already. So the question becomes what Shadow Spectres' role is and how they can be used effectively in your games. So Shadow Spectres are currently best at taking out 3 wound models or 2 wound models with the -1 damage special rule. So things like Plague Marines, they're actually very good at taking out with their focused weapon profile. So things like Terminators or other 3 wound models that have a decent armor save will be exceptionally susceptible to attacks by Shadow Spectres. So at 24 inches, these guys can pop off 5 shots with maybe a Jinx thrown in there. They can be hitting Terminators on 3s, wounding on 3s, and killing on 4s, which is pretty effective considering each one only costs 26 points for that role. So after a couple of turns of shooting at Terminators, they'll probably make up their points back. Now, they can also do this while popping in and out of obscuring terrain and thus blocking line of sight to a majority of the enemy army. Because to be honest with you, they're too expensive to trade with. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to land these guys right in front of the enemy army and try to take something out in an alpha strike. This is not what the unit is designed to do. And really, the unit operates best when hiding behind obscuring terrain and taking pot shots at incoming Terminators or light vehicles and things like that. So having said that, there are 2 builds which I have found the most effective with these guys. The first one I like to call the Prismatic 5, and the second one is called the Crystal Kingdom. So the Prismatic 5 is a basic unit of 5 Shadow Spectres that costs 130 points, and this is a budget unit. So it's great at picking off high wound models like Terminators and light vehicles while remaining hidden because the low model count of this unit makes it really easy to hide, pop in and out of cover, and not be shot back. So chances are, over the course of a game, if you can keep these guys alive, they will survive and you will be able to make the best use out of them for their points. And because of their -1 to hit, indirect fire weapons are going to be extremely inaccurate against them. So again, it's something that you can keep in mind when using these guys. You really do want to keep them behind obscuring terrain. And the next build is the Crystal Kingdom. So this is 10 Shadow Spectres, which is 260 points. This is a very expensive unit, so you don't want to use it lightly, and you don't want to throw it away. And basically, this unit is a pure damage dealing unit meant for high value target elimination. Best used against Terminators or other 3 wound targets in conjunction with buffs like Guide and Doom and Jinx. Because when these guys come in, you want to make sure that whatever unit they're shooting at is dead and buried. So a unit of 10 of these with the right buffs can easily slaughter a unit of Terminators on the other side of the board. Now they will have a little bit more trouble killing Nurgle Terminators with the -1 damage, so those Death Blight Terminators that people love running in Death Guard lists are going to be a little bit harder to take out with these guys. But again, they're still effective, they're just not as effective. So when you're facing Death Guard, you probably want to use these guys to just take out Plague Marines, because Plague Marines are a little bit more manageable with the stats that these guys have on their weapons. And again, as a side note, these guys are pretty decent at taking out light vehicles like land speeders, but can also do some serious damage against a doomed rhino or other target like that. So again, these guys aren't the best against toughness 7 vehicles, but they can do some damage to them in a pinch. Now, I have to say, I have used Shadow Spectres in a couple of my recent games as proxies. I don't actually have the real models, even though I think the models are great. I haven't purchased Forge World models since I purchased a Wraithseer, which I still use from time to time. But there is something I want to say about Forge World units in your army, a bit of a disclaimer. So Forge World units are obviously somewhat dated, and Shadow Spectres are no exception. Even though the models look terrific and they look like they could be new, they're actually quite a few years old and they haven't really seen many updates. And Forge World units are also not as subject to change and updates as normal Craftworld units are from the Codex, and they could become obsolete. So I hope this doesn't happen, but it's already happened to several Craftworld Forge World units, including the Wasp Assault Walkers, which were honestly some of my favorite models. I actually had some back in the day, but had to sell them because they no longer actually have rules associated with them. And a lot of people are just using them as regular War Walkers now. So again, something to keep in mind about Forge World units is that they might actually become obsolete, which I really hope they don't. I was actually hoping to see Shadow Spectres as one of the new units in the new Eldar Codex. Unfortunately, we didn't get that, so we're going to have to wait a little bit to see what happens to these guys. But I hope that they continue to be used in some way and they continue to be, at least usable in normal games. So in conclusion, I think Shadow Spectres are a very decent unit, but unfortunately they have an extremely niche role in which they excel. So they're really good at killing 3-wound models and light vehicles, but they aren't too effective outside of that role. So despite their dual weapon profile, they're really only great at killing those 3-wound models, which I mentioned previously. And the thing is they do pay a premium price for this quote-unquote versatility. So for what they do, they are a little bit on the expensive side, and the other problematic part about Shadow Spectres is if you do include them in an all-comers list, there might be times where you're running against an opponent in which they are completely useless, which is never a good feeling to have a unit in your army that just does absolutely nothing in certain matchups. So Shadow Spectres are a decent unit, but they're so specialized that as often is the case, they won't get a lot of use in every matchup. So you have to be careful about that. All right. And again, lastly, one of the biggest shames about these guys, I think, is that they lack Exarch powers, which really steals a part of the character of the unit, I feel. And I feel like maybe Forge World or GW should work on making some compatible rules in which they get some Exarch powers. I think that'd be really cool, and I think it'd be a great way to energize the unit and make it a little bit more competitive and usable in casual and competitive play. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video, and I hope I covered these guys well enough for you. I've not played much Shadow Spectres, but I have tried them in a couple games as of recently in preparation of this video, and honestly, I wasn't too disappointed with them. They do pretty decent work against Terminators and other 3-wound models, and in a pinch, they're decent at dealing with regular Space Marines that you might need to eliminate 1 or 2 off of an objective. So overall, I have no complaints with them. I just think that they need to be a little more streamlined to become current with the rest of our codex. So what that means is they probably need a slight points decrease, and they probably need an Exarch with actual Exarch powers. And once they get that, I think they can actually be a very viable and semi-competitive unit, just depending on what they get as far as their Exarch powers. So I'm hoping to see more of these guys, honestly. I think they're a really fun unit to use, and obviously, like most Forge World units, they have really awesome models. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Peace out. I'll see you guys next time. And as always, if you have any comments, leave them in the comment section. I'd really like to hear your guys' opinions and just general thoughts on Shadow Spectres. So, not a typical unit that Eldar players take because they are Forge World, but an extremely cool unit to say the least. All right, everybody, I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.